Picture this: a single sheet of parchment, brittle with age, its edges frayed by centuries of neglect. On its surface, intricate lines and annotations form the blueprint of a fortress so formidable, so brilliantly designed, it could defy entire armies. This isn't just a relic of the past. It's a testament to the sheer genius of medieval military minds. These forgotten blueprints, tucked away in dusty archives or buried beneath layers of history, hold secrets that redefine how we understand ancient warfare. They're not just drawings, they're battle plans, puzzles waiting to be solved, revealing how engineers and strategists of the Middle Ages turned stone and mortar into near impenetrable strongholds. What makes these designs so extraordinary? It's not just the towering walls or the labyrinthine corridors, it's the sheer creativity behind them. Imagine a fortress where every stairway, every gate, every hidden passage was meticulously calculated to confuse, trap, and outmaneuver invaders. These weren't just buildings, they were deadly chessboards where the architects anticipated every move of their enemies centuries in advance. From counter-siege tunnels to murder holes designed to rain destruction from above, these blueprints expose a level of sophistication that rivals even modern engineering. And yet, so many of these marvels have been lost to time until now. Today, we're unraveling the mysteries of these forgotten fortresses, piece by piece. We'll explore how medieval engineers turned geography into their greatest ally, crafting defenses that blended seamlessly with the landscape. You'll discover how a single blueprint could hold the key to understanding an entire era's approach to war, power, and survival. By the time we're done, you'll never look at a castle wall the same way again. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a journey into the minds of the ancients, where every line on parchment was a stroke of military genius. So let's step inside these lost fortresses and uncover the secrets they've been guarding for hundreds of years. These fragile parchments are far more than just architectural relics. They're windows into the very soul of medieval warfare. Every stroke of ink represents a calculated decision, a life or death gamble etched onto paper. Think about it. In an era without satellites or computer simulations, these blueprints were the difference between a kingdom's survival and its collapse. They didn't just outline walls and towers, they encoded entire philosophies of power. A fortress wasn't just a stronghold, it was a statement. Its design screamed defiance to enemies while reassuring allies, blending intimidation with innovation. Take, for example, the way these blueprints reveal resourcefulness. Medieval engineers didn't have endless supplies or modern machinery, so they worked with what they had. A cliffside became an unassailable barrier. A river was diverted to fill moats. Even the placement of arrow slits angled just so turned sunlight into a blinding weapon against attackers. These weren't random choices, they were masterclasses in efficiency where every stone and beam served multiple purposes, and the psychological warfare. Sheer brilliance, a labyrinth of dead-end corridors could demoralize invaders, while towering gatehouses were designed to make approaching armies feel small and vulnerable before the battle even began. But here's what's truly astonishing. These blueprints survived. Wars, fires, centuries of neglect, and yet they endure. Some were hidden in monastery libraries, protected by scholars who understood their value. Others were passed down like sacred texts, copied and recopied across generations. Even when the fortresses themselves crumbled, their plans lived on, whispering secrets to those patient enough to listen. That's why uncovering one today feels like striking gold. It's not just about the structure, it's about the mind behind it, the unseen general who plotted sightlines like a chess master, the anonymous craftsman who turned geometry into a weapon. These blueprints are their voices reaching across time to tell us how they defied the impossible. The survival of these medieval fortress blueprints is nothing short of miraculous, a delicate dance between human dedication and sheer luck. Many owe their existence to the quiet, ink-stained hands of monks in secluded monasteries. These scribes didn't just copy religious texts, they preserved military knowledge like sacred heirlooms, recognizing its value for future generations. Picture a dimly lit scriptorium, where candlelight flickered over parchment as a monk painstakingly traced the angular lines of a fortress gate or the curve of a siege-resistant tower. Every stroke was an act of defiance against time itself, but monasteries weren't the only guardians. Royal vaults hidden deep within castles safeguarded these designs like state secrets. Kings understood that losing a blueprint meant losing a strategic edge, so they buried them alongside treaties and treasure. Meanwhile, guilds of master builders, tight-knit networks of stonemasons and engineers, passed these plans down like trade secrets, ensuring their craft survived wars and dynasties. And then there's geography's role. The dry, arid air of places like the Middle East acted as a natural conservator, keeping ink from fading and vellum from crumbling for centuries. Some blueprints resurfaced by pure chance. Take the Ottoman archives, where stacks of forgotten documents yielded detailed fortress plans tucked between tax records and decrees. These weren't just discarded papers, they were time capsules waiting for the right moment to reveal their secrets. Now, let's turn to the oldest known surviving blueprint, the Theodosian walls of Constantinople. This wasn't just a sketch, it was a revolution in stone. Triple-layered defenses, interspersed with towers spaced precisely at bowshot intervals, created a killing zone no attacker could breach easily. The blueprint even accounted for seasonal winds, positioning Greek fire projectors to maximize their lethal range. Every detail, from the slope of the ramparts to the depth of the moats, was a calculated masterpiece. This single parchment didn't just outline walls, it encoded the survival of an empire. Standing atop a natural hill in the heart of modern-day Syria, the citadel of Aleppo isn't just old, it's a masterclass in defensive ingenuity. Its blueprint, dating back over 4,000 years, reads like a tactical manifesto. Imagine concentric rings of towering stone walls, each one higher than the last, forcing attackers to fight uphill through a gauntlet of death. But the real stroke of genius, the way its designers turned the landscape itself into a weapon. That hill wasn't chosen by accident. It was a calculated decision to give defenders the ultimate high ground. Archers perched on those walls didn't just shoot downward, they unleashed arrows at angles that turned the entire approach into a killing field. Look closer at those ancient plans, and you'll spot details that still impress engineers today. Underground tunnels snaked beneath the fortress, allowing defenders to move unseen or launch surprise counterattacks. The moat wasn't just a water-filled ditch. It was precisely dug to disrupt siege towers, its depth and width calculated to render those wooden behemoths useless. Even the gates were a psychological trap, staggered in a way that funneled invaders into narrow corridors where they'd be exposed to crossfire from hidden archer slots. Every element worked in terrifying harmony. What's truly remarkable is how these blueprints reveal a deep understanding of human behavior. Those staggered gates weren't just about defense, they exploited the chaos of battle. Attackers, already exhausted from breaching the outer walls, would find themselves disoriented in a maze of killing zones. Meanwhile, defenders could retreat inward to stronger positions, trading space for time. This wasn't just architecture, it was warfare crystallized into stone. and its influence echoes through history from Crusader castles to Renaissance fortresses, proving that 4 millennia ago, the builders of Aleppo weren't just constructing walls. They were rewriting the rules of war. Now, let's decode the hidden language of these plans, the precise geometry that made them so deadly. The angles of those walls weren't arbitrary. They were calculated to deflect projectiles and maximize defensive sightlines. Even the spacing between towers followed a mathematical rhythm, ensuring no blind spots for attackers to exploit. This level of precision, achieved without modern tools, hints at a lost world of knowledge, one where mastery of numbers meant the difference between survival and slaughter. Medieval architects didn't just build walls, they engineered mathematical nightmares for anyone daring to attack. Those seemingly random curves and angles in fortress blueprints. Every one was a calculated death sentence. Take the cracked des Chevaliers, where walls curved like a predator's grin. At first glance, it might look artistic, but that curvature was a ballistic shield deflecting cannon fire by sending shots skidding harmlessly into the dirt. And here's the chilling part. This was happening 200 years before Isaac Newton penned the laws of motion. These builders didn't just guess, they observed, experimented, and turned physics into fortifications. Now, let's talk about the geometry of fear. Arrow slits weren't just narrow windows, they were precision instruments. The outer opening might be wide enough to let an archer track moving targets, but the inner slot was a razor-thin gap, leaving attackers with almost nothing to hit. And the angles, brutally intentional. Tilted downward, they turned every arrow into a plunging shot, raining death from above while exposing the archer to minimal return fire. Even the spacing between battlements followed a deadly rhythm. Too close and defenders would trip over each other, too far and gaps would appear in their defense. The blueprints show exact measurements, often based on the average archer's stride, proving these designs were honed through generations of bloodied trial and error. Then there's the acoustics. Ever wonder how a single watchman's shout could echo across an entire fortress? Those vaulted gatehouses and rounded towers weren't just for show. They acted like natural amplifiers, bouncing warnings off stone with crystal clarity. In some castles, whispers from the outer walls could be heard clearly in the central keep, a medieval early warning system built right into the architecture. And the golden ratio, far from just a pretty number, it determined the proportions of towers and walls to distribute weight perfectly, making structures nearly earthquake-resistant. When enemies saw these fortresses looming on the horizon, they weren't just facing stone, they were staring down centuries of accumulated genius, where every line on parchment translated to another way to die. But the real horror lay in the hidden geometry, the traps. Staircases spiraled clockwise to force right-handed attackers to expose their unshielded sides while defenders struck downward with ease. Courtyards sloped imperceptibly toward hidden drains, turning rain into slick death traps for charging cavalry. Even the placement of wells was strategic, dug deep within inner walls so besiegers couldn't poison them, yet positioned to double as emergency escape tunnels if the outer defenses fell. These weren't buildings, they were three-dimensional puzzles where every wrong move meant oblivion. And the architects, they weren't just builders, they were chess masters playing a game where the board was made of stone and the stakes were kingdoms. The most terrifying fortresses weren't just strong, they were deceptive. Hidden within their blueprints lay traps so cruel, so ingeniously disguised, they turned every step into a potential death sentence. Take the castle of Chillon's infamous false floors. On the surface, they looked like ordinary stone until the weight of armored invaders triggered hidden mechanisms, sending them plummeting into pitch-black oubliettes below. These weren't just holes in the ground, they were psychological masterstrokes. Imagine being the first soldier to vanish without a sound, leaving your comrades staring at suddenly empty space where a man once stood. The message was clear, even the ground beneath your feet could betray you. Then there were the boiling oil chutes marked on blueprints with chilling simplicity, a single line labeled Death Pour. At Mont Saint-Michel, engineers exploited the tides themselves as a weapon. Their moats weren't just filled with water, they were timed to nature's clock. Attackers who charged across at low tide would find themselves trapped when the sea came rushing back, cutting off retreat and drowning entire battalions in icy waters. These weren't accidents of design, they were calculated environmental traps, turning nature into an ally against invasion. But the true horror lay in the annotations. Some blueprints bear notes so matter-of-fact they freeze the blood. Phrases like, "Here the enemy will burn," next to flue systems designed to funnel wildfire through stairwells, or "Killing Gallery," scribbled beside narrow corridors lined with inward-facing arrow slits. These weren't just instructions for builders, they were psychological profiles, revealing how deeply medieval architects understood fear as a weapon. A collapsing staircase didn't just kill the first man to step on it, it made every survivor question whether the next step would be their last. When gunpowder arrived, these designs evolved with terrifying adaptability. Thick walls angled to deflect cannonballs replaced straight battlements. Towers grew squat and rounded, trading height for resistance to artillery. Yet the core philosophy remained: outthink, outmaneuver, and terrify. The blueprints of Malbork Castle, for instance, show how engineers hollowed out sections of outer walls not to weaken them, but to create explosive chambers that would detonate inward when hit by cannon fire, showering attackers with stone shrapnel. Even in the face of technological revolution, medieval military genius found ways to turn an enemy's strength against them. What's most striking isn't just the brutality of these designs, but their surgical precision. Every trap, every killing zone was positioned to maximize chaos. Narrow passages forced attackers to bunch up, making them perfect targets for dropping stones from murder holes above. Curved walls created blind spots where defenders could regroup unseen. Even the placement of latrines was strategic, positioned over outer walls, so waste could become a foul, slippery weapon against climbers. These blueprints don't just show us how medieval fortresses were built. They reveal a cold, calculating artistry of war, where architecture became the ultimate weapon. The thunder of cannon fire didn't just change battles, it shattered centuries of military architecture. Overnight, towering walls that had stood invincible for generations became death traps, crumbling under the relentless pounding of iron shot. But medieval engineers didn't surrender to progress, they outmaneuvered it. The evidence lies in those hastily revised blueprints, where ink-stained fingers drew the future of warfare. Take Pomanova's star-shaped bastions, those jagged points weren't aesthetic choices. Each angle was a calculated deflection, turning incoming cannonballs into glancing blows that skittered harmlessly across stone. What's astonishing isn't just the innovation, but the speed. Within decades of gunpowder's arrival, these designs were already perfected, proving medieval minds could think generations ahead. Buried in those updated plans are secrets modern historians still marvel at. Walls didn't just get thicker, they grew smarter. Engineers layered them with shock-absorbing fill like compacted earth or rubble between stone facings, creating natural crumple zones to dissipate cannon fire's energy. And those sloping surfaces, pure physics. A 45-degree incline could reduce a direct hit's impact by half, a trick later borrowed by modern tank armor. But the real genius lurked underground. Networks of listening tunnels branched beneath fortresses, their walls lined with resonating copper tubes. A sentry with his ear to the metal could detect the faintest scrape of enemy pickaxes, turning the medieval equivalent of sonar into an early warning system against tunnel-digging sappers. What these blueprints reveal is a breathtaking adaptability. When cannons made high towers suicidal, engineers didn't abandon height, they reimagined it. The result, massive, squat artillery platforms camouflaged within fortress walls, their gun ports positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Even the humble ditch evolved into the glacis, a broad, gently sloping killing zone that forced cannon crews to expose themselves while offering defenders a clear shot. Every innovation served multiple purposes. The same earthen berm that absorbed cannon fire also concealed troop movements, while angled bastions provided flanking fire positions that turned approach routes into slaughterhouses. Yet the most striking change wasn't in stone, but in mindset. These weren't just stronger castles, they were architectural chameleons designed to evolve. Marginal notes in period blueprints show engineers speculating about future artillery ranges, deliberately overbuilding walls to withstand guns that didn't yet exist. Some even included modular elements, removable outerworks that could be abandoned or rebuilt as technology shifted. This wasn't mere construction, it was military science fiction, where quill pens anticipated inventions still centuries away. And when you see these designs side by side, the blunt, brutal geometry of gunpowder-era forts compared to the vertical grandeur of medieval keeps, you're not just looking at different buildings. You're witnessing the moment warfare leaped from the age of arrows to the brink of the modern world. Now, let's peel back another layer of deception, the art of architectural illusion. Because sometimes the most powerful defenses weren't made of stone, but of sheer psychological trickery. Optical illusions weren't just carnival tricks in the Middle Ages. They were life or death defenses etched into fortress blueprints with meticulous care. Take those false gates scribbled along castle walls. To an attacking army, they appeared as vulnerable entry points, luring them into charging straight toward what seemed like an opening, only to find solid stone at the last moment, while defenders rained arrows from concealed positions above. The psychological impact was devastating. Nothing demoralizes an army faster than realizing even their eyes can't be trusted. Then there's the Fortress of Dew's blinding brilliance. Its mirrored walls weren't decorative, they were solar warfare at its most sophisticated. Engineers calculated the precise angle to reflect sunlight into attackers' eyes during dawn assaults, when eastern-facing walls would catch the rising sun. Imagine staring into what you thought was a crumbling fortification, only to be met with a searing wall of light that turned your advance into a stumbling, half-blind massacre. This wasn't just defense, it was environmental manipulation, turning the sun itself into an ally. Carcassonne took deception further with its ghost defenders tactic. By spacing battlements unevenly, some real, some just wooden facades, the fortress could appear fully manned even with a skeleton crew. An approaching army would see silhouettes on every merlon, never knowing which shadows hid real archers until arrows started flying. Some blueprints even show painted arrow slits, creating the illusion of overlapping fields of fire where none existed. The goal wasn't just to mislead, it was to paralyze attackers with doubt, making every decision a gamble. But perhaps the most chilling trick hides in the margins of a Bohemian fortress plan. A single note reading, "Wolf pits under false grass." These weren't simple holes, they were layered traps. The top layer of turf was real enough to pass inspection by scouts, but beneath it lay a lattice of weak branches designed to collapse under the weight of armored troops. And below that, sharpened stakes angled upward, ensuring those who fell wouldn't rise again. This level of psychological warfare reveals a startling truth. Medieval engineers didn't just build walls, they weaponized imagination, forcing enemies to see threats where none existed and overlook dangers until it was too late. Now, let's pull back the curtain on the minds behind these masterpieces. Hidden in monastery records and guild ledgers are names like Villard de Honnecourt, a 13th century architect whose sketchbook reveals towers designed to appear taller through forced perspective, and Al-Muradi, an Andalusian engineer who wrote entire treatises on the science of deceptive angles. These weren't anonymous craftsmen, they were early psychologists, understanding that the most impenetrable fortress wasn't the one with the thickest walls, but the one that could make an entire army question reality itself. Their blueprints don't just show stone and mortar, they document the birth of asymmetric warfare, where perception became the ultimate battlefield. History remembers kings and conquerors, but the true architects of medieval warfare often worked in shadow. These weren't flamboyant visionaries signing their masterpieces. They were anonymous monks hunched over candlelit manuscripts, grizzled stonemasons whispering trade secrets, or battle-scarred engineers who'd seen firsthand what worked on the killing fields. Consider the Cistercian brothers who designed castles between prayers, their blueprints scrawled in Latin marginalia alongside psalms, or the Ottoman master builder whose name is lost to time, but whose revolutionary use of interlocking stonework made walls nearly earthquake-proof. Their genius wasn't just in stone, it was in silence. One rare exception peeks through the veil: Sébastien Le Prestre de Vauban, Louis XIV's fortification wizard. His notebooks reveal a mind constantly at war with itself, literally. Pages are crammed with ciphers, his measurements disguised as musical notation or biblical verses to thwart spies. Even his famous star forts, with their geometric perfection, were just the surface. Between the lines lay traps within traps, like his patented tumbling arches, seemingly solid vaults rigged to collapse when attackers massed beneath them. Yet for every Vauban, there were 100 nameless masters whose identities were deliberately erased by guilds protecting trade secrets. The true marvel is how these designs transcended borders. A single blueprint might blend Arab mathematics, Chinese earthwork techniques, and European metallurgy. Take the concentric castles of the Levant, their layered defenses owe as much to Byzantine engineers as to Crusader knights. Some plans even show clear influences from Mongol siege warfare, with rotating tower designs adapted from portable battering rams. This wasn't just cultural exchange. It was an arms race played out in parchment and ink, where the best ideas survived regardless of their origins. Now let's unravel history's greatest military what-if, the fortress that never was. Buried in the Vienna War archives lies a yellowed sketch labeled Project Phoenix. Dated 1582, it proposes a radical floating bastion for the Danube, a waterborne fortress with retractable chains to snare enemy ships and submerged fire chambers to boil the river itself. The designer, unknown, but the math is breathtaking. Calculations account for seasonal currents, ice flows, even the acoustic properties of water to amplify alarm bells. Had it been built, it might have changed the course of the Ottoman wars. Instead, it remains a ghost in the margins, whispering of possibilities lost to time. What these forgotten minds understood was that warfare wasn't just about strength, it was about adaptation. Their blueprints weren't static instructions, they were living documents, annotated over generations with notes like, "Here the Hungarians breached us in winter," or "Add iron plates after fire of 1506. Every stain, every correction tells a story of survival. And perhaps that's their greatest legacy, not the stones they left standing, but the relentless ingenuity that refused to accept defeat. Buried in the archives of Palermo lies a crumbling parchment that defies everything we know about 13th century warfare, the lost fortress plans of Emperor Frederick II. This wasn't just another castle, It was a coastal death machine straight out of a military fantasy. Imagine towers that could rotate on hidden tracks, aligning their arrow slits to track ships moving across the horizon. Submerged beneath the waves, iron spikes mounted on floating platforms, designed to rise with the tide and impale hulls attempting a nighttime landing. The blueprint even includes tidal calculations predicting exactly when hidden traps would be most lethal based on lunar cycles. This wasn't architecture, it was maritime chess played with stone and steel. Historians still argue fiercely over why this marvel was never built. Some claim the rotating towers were pure fantasy, impossible with medieval technology. But recent discoveries prove otherwise. A smith's ledger from Naples lists payments for great brass rings for the turning towers, while a monk's diary mentions witnessing a scale model that moved as if by unseen hands. Others whisper of sabotage. Frederick was known as the wonder of the world, but his ambitious projects made enemies. Just months after these plans were drafted, his chief engineer vanished and construction suddenly shifted to conventional castles. Whether by technical limits or political knives, this fortress became one of history's great what-ifs. Yet the real revelation lies in the margins. Tiny sketches show sea creatures, octopuses with gripping tentacles, crabs with crushing claws annotated with notes like "emulate the lobster's hinge," near drawings of retractable gates. This wasn't mere doodling, it was early biomimicry where nature's designs became weapons. Medieval engineers didn't just copy animals, they weaponized their evolution. Those rotating towers, inspired by sunflower stems tracking the sun, the spike traps modeled after sea urchin spines, even the fortress layout mirrored a nautilus shell spiraling corridors that would funnel attackers into ever-tightening kill zones. Now, let's follow that thread of inspiration beyond Sicily. From Welsh castles shaped like peregrine falcons to Mongolian walls mimicking termite mounds' passive cooling, nature didn't just influence fortress design, it became the ultimate military textbook. And nowhere is this clearer than in the desert fortresses of the Levant, where architects turned the very heat of the sun into a weapon. The Alhambra's walls held a secret far more ingenious than mere beauty they breathed. Hidden within its famed red fortifications lay an irrigation system so precise, it mimicked the very veins of a leaf. Channels carved into stone carried water not just for gardens, but as a defensive lifeline. During sieges, these waterways could be diverted to flood tunnels sappers dug beneath the walls, drowning invaders in darkness. The blueprint's annotations reveal an eerie parallel. The same capillary action that sustained termite mounds in the desert was harnessed to sustain human strongholds. Nature's solutions became siege-breaking strategies, but the Alhambra wasn't alone in this silent collaboration with the wild. Welsh castles like Beaumaris took inspiration from beehives. Their concentric rings of walls mirrored honeycomb's hexagonal efficiency, maximizing defensive strength with minimal materials. Even the angles of their towers followed the same geometric logic bees used to reinforce their hives against storms. And then there were the underground networks. At Cappadocia's Derinkuyu, entire cities sprawled beneath the earth, their ventilation shafts replicating the root systems of ancient oaks. These weren't just tunnels, they were lungs, drawing fresh air through miles of stone while stifling enemy torches with calculated draft. Perhaps the most startling fusion of nature and warfare lies in the gardens tucked between battlements. Cracked des Chevaliers blueprints show herb plots labeled for wounds and hunger, their placement near kitchens and infirmaries no accident. Siege agriculture wasn't just practical, it was psychological. A garrison watching onions grow atop their walls knew time was on their side, while attackers staring up at thriving greens faced the demoralizing truth: this fortress wouldn't starve. Even the plants were weapons. Poison ivy trained to climb outer walls, rose bushes with thorns strategically planted to slow cavalry. Every leaf and stem served a purpose. Astoundingly, some blueprints included lunar calendars alongside masonry instructions. The fortress of Sigiriya in Sri Lanka positioned its reservoirs to reflect moonlight, creating a shimmering illusion of depth that made moats appear bottomless at night. Others aligned gateways with solstices, using the sun's longest day to blind approaching armies at dawn. These weren't superstitions, they were calculations. When medieval architects looked to the stars, they weren't seeking omens, they were calibrating weapons. And nowhere is this more chillingly evident than in the astrological diagrams scribbled in the margins of Bohemian fortress plans, where the positions of planets dictated the optimal days to pour boiling pitch, based on wind patterns observed over decades. The cosmos itself became a co-conspirator in defense. Now consider the ultimate irony. While modern architects strained to make buildings green, medieval engineers had mastered sustainability as survival. Their blueprints didn't just borrow from nature, they spoke its language fluently, turning ecosystems into allies. A falcon's dive inspired murder holes angled for maximum velocity. Spiderwebs informed the layout of net traps to tangle cavalry. Even the humble earthworm, with its burrowing genius, taught sappers how to undermine enemy walls silently. These designs whisper a truth we're only rediscovering today. The best solutions often aren't invented, they're observed. Those celestial alignments weren't just artistic flourishes, they were calculated acts of faith fused with military science. At Sigiriya, the lion-shaped fortress doesn't just face Orion's belt for spectacle. Its three towering gateways mirror the constellation stars, creating a celestial map underfoot. Attackers storming those gates at dawn on the winter solstice would find themselves silhouetted against the rising sun, perfect targets for archers perched above. This wasn't mysticism, it was astronomy weaponized. The builders knew what modern soldiers forget. Battles are won not just with steel, but with the sky itself as an ally. European castles took this fusion further, embedding chapels into their very bones at angles that caught the first light on saints' days. The Crac des Chevaliers Chapel aligns so precisely that every June 24th, the feast of St. John the Baptist, sunlight strikes the altar like a golden arrow at noon. To defenders, this wasn't just pretty symbolism, it was divine reassurance timed to the campaigning season, a celestial morale boost when sieges loomed. Even the thickness of chapel walls often matched biblical measurements, 12 cubits thick in homage to Jerusalem's temple, blending scripture with stone. But the real cipher lies in the symbols scrawled between measurements. A Maltese architect's blueprint shows the Pisces constellation inked beside a cistern, marking when seasonal rains would fill it. Venetian plans bear tiny zodiac signs where walls meet, not as decoration but as coded reminders: Leo for when the Adriatic winds favored fireboat attacks, Capricorn for when frost might crack mortar. These weren't idle doodles, they were operational calendars disguised as stars. The most haunting revelation comes from a Bohemian manuscript where constellations overlay siege engines. Ursa Major's stars mark the positions of trebuchets, while Mars's path predicts the optimal fortnight for assaults. Here, the cosmos wasn't just observed, it was conscripted. And when you see these patterns repeated from Japan's star-shaped Heimji Castle to the Inca's solar-aligned Sacsayhuaman, one truth emerges. Across continents and eras, the greatest fortress builders shared an unshakable conviction that to master war, you first had to map the heavens. Now, let's decipher the most enigmatic marks of all the secret symbols scratched into these parchments by hands we'll never know. Hidden symbols etched into fortress blueprints weren't just doodles, they were life or death ciphers, a secret language known only to the initiated. Take that innocuous-looking cross scratched near a gatehouse foundation. To most, it might seem like a mason's mark, but to rebels plotting infiltration, it revealed a deliberately weakened section of mortar, ripe for nighttime chiseling. Or consider the owl insignia hidden in the margins of a Bohemian castle plan, not a decorative flourish, but a silent marker for escape tunnels disguised as drainage shafts. These weren't random scribbles, they were clandestine battle plans in plain sight. The Teutonic Knights took this subterfuge further, embedding Norse runes into their blueprints to map everything from treasure vaults to traitors' gates. Archaeologists recently uncovered one such blueprint beneath Malbork Castle, where the Algiers rune, a symbol of protection, marked hidden chambers stocked with siege supplies, while the inverted Tiu as rune-flagged corridors rigged for collapse. This was more than just notation. It was psychological warfare encoded in ink. A captured blueprint might reveal a fortress's layout, but without the key to its symbols, invaders would miss the real dangers, like staircases labeled with raven symbols, indicating they'd been subtly altered to crumble under the weight of armored troops. What's astonishing is how these codes crossed cultures. A Moorish fortress in Spain might use Quranic verse numbers to denote trap locations, while a Hungarian stronghold employed Celtic knotwork to map underground springs. The shared thread necessity. In an era where blueprints could fall into enemy hands, every mark had to serve two purposes, guiding allies while misleading adversaries. Some architects even layered their deception, like the Byzantine engineer who drafted identical-looking towers but annotated one set with tiny fish scales, revealing which walls contained hollow chambers for boiling oil. Now trace those symbols along trade routes, and you'll uncover a shadow network of knowledge. The same dragon icon that marked flammable powder stores in Venetian arsenals appears in Korean fortress plans, hinting at exchanges between East and West. Mongol siege engineers likely carried coded diagrams along the Silk Road, their horse-shaped glyphs teaching new tactics from Kiev to Beijing. Even the Aztecs used jaguar paw prints in their defensive sketches, a universal shorthand for ambush point that Spanish conquistadors failed to decipher until it was too late. This wasn't just shared technology, it was the birth of an international language of war where ink and imagination became the ultimate weapons, the most chilling discovery. Some symbols were never meant to be read at all. French archivists recently identified ghost marks, deliberate false codes added to mislead spies. A compass rose might point 30 degrees off true north, or a sketched moat might conceal its true depth behind carefully inked waves. Invisible ink recipes from the era mention walnut gall mixtures that faded after a few years, leaving only the decoy markings intact. These architects weren't just building fortresses. They were playing four-dimensional chess, anticipating how their designs might be stolen, copied, or reverse-engineered across generations. As trade routes expanded, so did this visual espionage. A Scottish castle's blueprint might borrow Venetian window designs, but hide Norse-style wolf teeth carvings that local stonemasons would recognize as sabotage warnings. Crusader castles in the Levant fused Arabic water symbols with Frankish masonry notation, creating hybrid codes that only bilingual engineers could fully interpret. Even nature got co-opted into the system. Castle gardens planted with specific herbs weren't just pharmacies but living cipher keys, where rosemary bushes might signal the presence of underground passages. Now consider the ultimate irony. Today's historians are decoding these symbols using artificial intelligence, training algorithms to spot patterns across thousands of fragmented documents. What medieval architects meant to conceal, modern technology is revealing not just the secrets of individual fortresses, but the astonishing global conversation happening in the margins of these parchments. Every rediscovered symbol rewrites our understanding of how knowledge flowed in the ancient world, proving that even in an age of swords and shields, information was the most powerful weapon of all. Trade routes didn't just move silk and spices, they smuggled military secrets in plain sight. Picture a Genos merchant caravan winding through the Caucasus, its cargo hides concealing rolled parchment between bolts of cloth. To customs inspectors, it was just another shipment, but those scrolls held something far more valuable than goods. They carried the DNA of warfare itself. Armenian architects fleeing Mongol invasions tucked fortress blueprints between carpets. Byzantine prisoners of war bartered siege engine sketches for their freedom. Even Marco Polo's journals whisper of strange mechanical arts, observed in Karakorum that later surfaced in Venetian arsenals. This wasn't just cultural exchange, it was an arms race on horseback. The Mongols became history's most unlikely engineering professors. As their empire stretched from Beijing to Budapest, they didn't just conquer cities, they harvested knowledge. Chinese counterweight trebuchet designs traveled west in the saddlebags of Mongol Tumans, evolving into the massive counterpoise engines that shattered crusader walls at Acre. Persian water clock timers, adapted by Mongol siege masters, became the precision triggers for European gatehouse traps. And in a twist of irony, the same nomadic warriors who lived in portable yurts revolutionized stone fortifications. Their scouts documented every defensive innovation they encountered, creating a sprawling database of military architecture. Nowhere is this fusion more striking than in Cyprus's Kyrenia Castle. At first glance, its soaring walls look typically Frankish, but look closer, those zigzagging, swallowtail battlements crowning the towers are pure Armenian, a design perfected in the highlands of Anatolia to deflect catapult shots. The murder holes above the gate, their angled chutes mirror Abbasid designs from Baghdad. Even the courtyard's geometric paving hides a secret. It's a scaled replica of a Mongolian tactical deployment grid, allowing defenders to rehearse counterattacks like chess pieces. This wasn't just a castle, it was a United Nations of military ingenuity. The real game changer was how these ideas mutated in transit. When Middle Eastern wind towers, passive cooling structures, reached Mediterranean fortresses, engineers didn't just copy them. They weaponized the concept, redirecting breezes to fan Greek fire flames or disperse poison smoke through enemy tunnels. Chinese papermaking techniques, originally transported for administrative records, allowed besieged garrisons to mass-produce flammable arrow wrappings. Every innovation adapted to its new home, blending with local traditions to create something unprecedented. But the ultimate testament to this global dialogue stands in the Syrian desert cracked des Chevaliers. Its concentric rings owe debts to Byzantine manuals, its arrow slits to Egyptian templates, and its granary system to Mongol logistics. Yet when Saladin's armies faced it, they weren't just confronting stone, they were battling the collective genius of 3 continents. The fortress that defied them wasn't purely European, Arab, or Asian. It was the first true hybrid of global military thought, a preview of warfare's interconnected future. Now let's descend into Crack's most ingenious deception, a labyrinth where even the walls played mind games. Perched atop an isolated rock plateau in the Judean desert, Masada wasn't just a fortress, it was a psychological masterpiece carved into the landscape. Those sheer 400-meter cliffs formed natural walls no ladder could scale, while the winding snake path entrance forced attackers to advance single file under a barrage of arrows. But the real stroke of genius lay hidden in the mountain itself. Engineers had transformed its hollowed-out belly into a vast underground network. where 16 colossal cisterns could hold nearly 40,000 cubic meters of rainwater, enough to sustain 1,000 souls through years of siege. And that food elevator wasn't some primitive pulley. It was a vertical supply line cut through solid rock, allowing defenders to hoist provisions from hidden valley storehouses without exposing themselves to Roman artillery. What makes Masada's blueprint extraordinary isn't just its physical defenses, but its brutal calculus of human endurance. Every element from the angled staircases designed to exhaust invaders to the strategic placement of grain silos beneath sleeping quarters revealed an unflinching understanding of siege psychology. When Flavius Silva's legions finally breached the walls after months of constructing an enormous assault ramp, they found not the desperate survivors expected, but a chilling silence. The defenders had burned everything except the food stores, a final message that they'd chosen death on their own terms rather than surrender. That act transformed Masada from a military stronghold into a timeless symbol, proving that the most unconquerable fortress isn't made of stone, but of indomitable will. Yet these same blueprints reveal another layer. Often overlooked fortresses weren't just instruments of war, but economic powerhouses. Look closely at Masada's storage chambers, and you'll find not just weapons, but carefully organized ledgers etched into clay. Olive oil amphorae bore tax stamps, granary floors were divided into measured portions for rationing, and workshops produced goods for trade even under siege. This duality defined medieval strongholds across continents. The Rock of Gibraltar controlled Mediterranean trade routes like a toll booth, while Mali's mud brick Sankore University doubled as a treasury housing gold dust measured by the ton. Fortresses didn't just protect wealth, they generated it. Consider how castle kitchens functioned as early industrial centers. Dover Castle's underground bakeries could produce 8,000 loaves daily, not just for soldiers, but as currency to pay laborers reinforcing the walls. At Crac des Chevaliers, blacksmith forges minted emergency siege coins from melted-down silver plate, creating an ad hoc wartime economy. Even the placement of markets within fortress walls followed military logic, positioned where defenders could quickly seal them off if spies were spotted, yet open enough to attract merchants whose taxes funded the garrison. These weren't just buildings, they were meticulously engineered ecosystems where commerce and combat coexisted. The genius of fortress economics reached its peak with Venetian naval bases. Their blueprint annotations include precise calculations showing how high tariffs on spice cargoes could finance next season's cannon foundries. Salt stores in Suomenlinna fortress served dual purposes, preserving food while backing a salt-based credit system for sailors. And in a stroke of economic warfare, some citadels like Malta's Fort St. Angelo deliberately overstocked grain to create artificial famines in surrounding regions, weakening potential invaders. Every barrel of wine, every bale of wool became a strategic asset, proving that the true art of fortress building wasn't just about defying sieges, but making sure your walls held more value intact than they ever would in ruins. Now trace your finger along the faded ink of a 15th century ledger from Rhodes, and you'll uncover the ultimate economic weapon, the Knights Hospitallers' siege insurance contracts. Merchants paid premium rates to store goods within the fortress walls, funding defensive upgrades while creating a vested interest for the business class to resist surrender. It was medieval derivatives trading with crossbows as collateral, a financial innovation as formidable as any trebuchet. These blueprints don't just record measurements, they preserve the birth of modern economic warfare, where gold proved mightier than steel when both were locked behind the same impenetrable walls. Fortresses didn't just guard gold, they were gold. Step inside the Tower of London's vaults, and you'd find more than just crown jewels glittering in torchlight. Ledgers etched into the walls reveal a bustling financial hub where loans were secured against land, where merchants paid to store silks and spices, and where even the king's debts were carefully recorded. This wasn't just a strongbox, it was a medieval Wall Street with arrow slits. Across Europe, castle blueprints included dedicated trading halls where armored knights doubled as notaries, witnessing contracts with swords at their sides. Security wasn't an afterthought, it was the foundation of commerce. Now follow the Silk Road to Anatolia, where Turkish fortresses like Alanya''s Red Tower operated as customs houses carved in stone. Caravans stretching from China to Venice would queue for days, their camels laden with porcelain and pearls, while officials calculated taxes based on intricate tariff tables chiseled into the walls. The genius, these forts didn't just collect wealth, they multiplied it. Hidden chambers beneath the courtyards served as early banks, where merchants could deposit silver in one location and withdraw equivalent value hundreds of miles away using sealed clay tokens. It was a proto-banking network secured by crossbows and boiling oil, but the real economic revolution happened in the Mediterranean. Malta's Fort St. Angelo didn't just store the Knights Hospitalers' treasure, it printed it. Blueprints show minting rooms positioned directly above the armory, where silver from Spanish galleons could be melted down and stamped into coins within hours of arrival. The vaults beneath featured an ingenious accounting system, concentric rings of chests, with the outer rings holding currency for daily trade and the innermost circle containing bullion reserves. Attack the fortress, and you weren't just facing knights, you were assaulting the entire region's financial infrastructure. Women shaped these stone titans in ways history books often overlook. Take Elena of Aquitaine, whose travels across Europe inspired her to demand rounded towers in her castles, not for aesthetics, but because she'd seen how easily square corners crumbled under Byzantine trebuchets. Then there's Melisende, Queen of Jerusalem, who redesigned the gates of the Tower of David after witnessing how narrow entrances could bottleneck attackers while allowing commerce to flow. Her innovations turned a military choke point into a thriving marketplace where taxes funded the kingdom's defenses. Even more fascinating are the unnamed women, the castellans' wives who kept fortress ledgers, the merchant widows who financed new walls, the nuns who designed convent fortresses with dual-purpose chapels that could store grain beneath their altars. Their contributions echo in subtle blueprint details: wider staircases for servants carrying trade goods, hidden gardens that fed garrisons during sieges, even the placement of windows to illuminate accounting tables at peak trading hours. These weren't just buildings shaped by war, they were ecosystems shaped by the quiet, relentless genius of women who understood that true security meant balancing swords and scales. Now trace your finger along the margins of a Welsh castle blueprint, and you might spot a tiny rose sketched beside the granary, a signature left by a noblewoman who insisted on doubling its size after a famine. It's a reminder that behind every towering wall, there were minds calculating not just battles but bread, and that's where fortress design reveals its deepest truth. The strongest foundations weren't made of stone, but of foresight. Beneath the elegant chambers and sweeping staircases of medieval castles lurked a shadow world of calculated cruelty blueprint annotations marking oubliettes from the French oublier, meaning to forget, where prisoners vanished into darkness, or corridors intentionally built with uneven steps to send invaders tumbling into pits. The coldest calculations often hid in plain sight, like the innocuous-looking well at Château de Falaise, which French archivists recently discovered wasn't for water at all. Its shaft led to a submerged chamber where attackers tunneling beneath the walls would drown in rising groundwater. These weren't defensive measures, they were psychological warfare etched onto parchment. One particularly chilling blueprint from Bohemia includes a seemingly decorative spiral near the gatehouse until you realize it marks a screaming stair. This twisted staircase amplified even whispers from the dungeon below, ensuring prisoners' agonies would unsettle guards' meals in the hall above. Other plans specify weeping walls, stones deliberately set with porous mortar so winter frost would seep through, making cells unbearably damp. The architects didn't just want to kill, they wanted to break spirits methodically. Yet the most disturbing revelations come from marginal notes. A Welsh castle's blueprint casually labels a narrow passage. Here the traitor's light fades, referencing a corridor that grew progressively darker until victims stumbled into a sheer drop. Venetian designs used musical notation to indicate torture chambers, a treble clef marking where acoustic vaults would magnify interrogators' voices to deafening levels. These annotations weren't mere instructions, they were diaries of despair, documenting how architecture itself could become an instrument of terror. Nowhere is this more harrowing than in the Crusader fortress of Carrack. Its blueprints show a chapel directly above the dungeon, not for mercy, but so prisoners would hear hymns while shackled in filth. The same parchment includes sketches of a Judas chair, a stone seat suspended over the latrine shaft where captives would dangle for weeks. What makes these designs so unsettling isn't their brutality, but their clinical precision. Measurements are exact, sight lines calculated, durations noted, proof that medieval engineers understood prolonged suffering could be as strategic as any trebuchet volley. Perhaps the ultimate testament to this dark artistry lies in the mirror chambers of Moorish Spain. Hidden beneath the Alhambra's ornate halls were windowless rooms lined with polished metal, where captives faced endless reflections of their own deteriorating state. The blueprints described them euphemistically as contemplation cells, but their true purpose was existential warfare to make prisoners confront their own unraveling minds. This wasn't just punishment, it was psychological dismantling through architecture. As we decipher these grim pages, a pattern emerges. The greatest fortresses weren't designed solely to withstand sieges, but to weaponize despair itself. Those meticulous lines and annotations reveal minds that understood walls could do more than stop arrows, they could crush hope. And in that revelation, we confront an uncomfortable truth about medieval warfare. Sometimes the most enduring victories weren't won on battlements, but in the darkness between the lines of a blueprint. The architects of fear didn't stop at human suffering, they enlisted nature itself as an accomplice. Hidden beneath innocuous labels like kennel or dovecote in fortress blueprints lay some of history's most brutal psychological weapons. Nuremberg Castle's records reveal how its falconry tower doubled as a terror chamber, where birds of prey were trained to attack prisoners' faces when bells rang, an early form of conditioned torture. Meanwhile, Venetian arsenals bred giant mastiffs specifically for their echoing barks, which designers amplified through stone tubes to simulate an unseen legion of hounds prowling beneath prisoners' feet. Some of the most chilling innovations came from Moorish Spain, where engineers turned simple animal husbandry into siege-breaking terror. The Alhambra's blueprints show bee corridors, narrow tunnels connecting apiaries to arrow slits. When invaders approached, defenders would smoke the hives, sending swarms of enraged bees through the stone veins of the fortress straight into enemy formations. Similar designs appear in Crusader castles, where dovecotes weren't just for messaging, their birds carried burning flax to ignite thatched roofs in enemy camps. Even fish became weapons. Syrian fortress moats were deliberately stocked with giant catfish bread to chew on submerged attackers attempting nighttime infiltrations. Perhaps the most disturbing animal weaponization came from the East. Ottoman fortress plans discovered in Budapest detail snake pits beneath gatehouses, not random holes, but carefully climate-controlled chambers where vipers were kept docile with cool air until attackers breached certain points. Then guards would redirect hot air ducts to awaken the serpents en masse, sending them slithering up through gratings into the invader's path. The psychological impact was calculated precisely. Notes in the margin specify that cobras were preferred for their hooded display before striking. This biological warfare reached its apex in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The walls of Cambodia's Angkor Wat weren't just carved with divine faces, they were perforated with thousands of tiny holes housing territorial wasps. When vibrations from siege engines disturbed them, clouds of insects would erupt from the stone itself, creating the illusion that the gods were unleashing their wrath. Similarly, Mayan fortress builders engineered entire ecosystems. Their stepped pyramids doubled as ant nests, with passages designed to funnel leafcutter colonies into enemy scaling ropes where they devour the fibers within hours. What makes these designs so unsettling isn't just their cruelty, but their clinical precision. The Nuremberg Falconry Tower's blueprints include exact measurements for perch heights calibrated to maximize facial strikes. Venetian dog tunnels feature acoustic diagrams showing how barks would resonate at specific frequencies to induce panic. Even the Alhambra's B corridors have airspeed calculations ensuring the insects would arrive furious but alive. These weren't improvised horrors, they were laboratory-perfected systems where every feather, fang, and stinger became a calibrated instrument of control. Yet the ultimate psychological weapon might have been the simplest, the silent threat. Dozens of fortress plans include unlabeled chambers marked only with animal icons, a wolf's head here, a scorpion there. Modern archaeologists debate whether these were actual menageries or just clever bluffs. After all, nothing paralyzes an attacker quite like wondering what unseen horrors lurk behind the next gate. That ambiguity may have been the greatest design triumph of all, turning imagination itself into a fortress wall. Deep in the archives of Istanbul, a single parchment redefines our understanding of biological warfare, the infamous Dragon Tower blueprint from Byzantine Trebizond. This wasn't just another defensive structure, it was a nightmarish fusion of zoology and military engineering. The drawings depict a hollow tower filled with stacked clay hives, connected to arrow slits by narrow flues. When attackers scaled the walls, guards would ignite smoke pots beneath the hives, driving swarms of enraged bees through stone channels directly into enemy faces. But the real horror lay in the annotations, notes specifying the cultivation of a particularly aggressive Carpathian bee strain, bred to target the moist membranes of eyes and throats. The Persians took this concept even further with their fire camel stables, marked clearly on siege plans discovered near Isfahan. These weren't ordinary animal pens, they were chemical warfare labs. Camels were fitted with flammable baskets reinforced by iron frames, their humps protected by asbestos-lined cloth. Blueprints show training yards where the creatures were conditioned to charge toward torchlight, becoming living incendiary devices against wooden siege engines. The most chilling detail, tiny symbols of hourglasses beside each stall, indicating how long the animals could endure burning before collapsing, calculated to maximize destruction while minimizing wasted livestock. Mongol fortress plans reveal an opposite approach to animal integration. Their wolf-proof corrals weren't about weaponizing beasts but outsmarting them. Ingenious rotating fences kept livestock safe from predators at night, while strategically placed wolf dens outside the walls served as natural early warning systems. Guards knew an attack was imminent when the howls suddenly stopped, silenced by approaching human armies. Now let's unravel history's most enigmatic animal blueprint, the feathered serpent design from Chichen Itza. At first glance, it appears to depict decorative stonework, but look closer. Those intricate carvings of plumed snakes actually map out hollow channels connecting to underground chambers filled with captive macaws. When invaders breached the outer walls, defenders would release the shrieking birds through hidden shafts, their rainbow wings and piercing cries creating the illusion of gods descending to defend the city. Psychological warfare reached its zenith here where architecture, nature, and human belief systems colluded to turn terror into an exact science. The Aztecs perfected this art with their jaguar runs, narrow corridors lined with stone grooves that amplified the sound of captive big cats pacing behind hidden screens. Spanish conquistador diaries describe the paralyzing effect of hearing unseen jaguars growling from the walls themselves. What they didn't realize was even more brilliant. The grooves also funneled hallucinogenic smoke from underground ritual chambers, making attackers believe the stones themselves were coming alive with demonic forces. Perhaps the ultimate testament to this fusion of biology and military science comes from a single footnote in a Venetian archive. It mentions a now-lost Byzantine manual describing how to cultivate special lichens on fortress walls, species that glowed faintly at night to illuminate attackers while remaining invisible to defenders accustomed to the darkness. This wasn't just warfare, it was ecological manipulation on a microscopic scale. Every leaf, every feather, every buzzing wing had been conscripted into service, proving that in the medieval world, the line between natural history and military strategy didn't just blur. It vanished completely. The legend of Prester John's fortress reads like something torn from a fantastical manuscript, walls plated in gold, gates manned by mechanical sentinels, and towers so high they scraped the heavens. This mythical Christian king's stronghold, whispered about in European courts and monasteries, wasn't just a tale, it was a geopolitical phantom that lured explorers across uncharted oceans. The so-called blueprint of this impossible fortress, likely forged by clever scribes, circulated for centuries, its descriptions growing more elaborate with each retelling. Yet the real magic wasn't in its authenticity, but in its power to move empires. Vasco da Gama carried copies of these dubious plans as he rounded the Cape of Good Hope, hoping to find this ally against Islamic powers. Even Columbus referenced Prester John's kingdom in his logs, proving that a well-crafted legend could alter the course of history as decisively as any stone battlement. What's fascinating isn't just the hoax itself, but what it reveals about medieval minds. These fabricated walls of gold tapped into a deeper longing for divine allies, for technological marvels, for a world where faith could manifest as physical might. The automatons guarding its gates, they mirrored real mechanical wonders of the age, like the clockwork angels in European cathedrals or the hydraulic puppets in Byzantine throne rooms. The legend's endurance speaks to a universal truth. A fortress isn't just measured by its walls, but by the stories it inspires, and sometimes those stories could outbuild any mason. Yet for all their ingenuity, even the greatest fortresses harbored fatal flaws. Take the mighty walls of Constantinople, impenetrable for 1,000 years, until attackers noticed one neglected postern gate left unfortified. Or the Crusader castles of the Levant, whose towering keeps became death traps when gunpowder rendered their height a liability. These weren't just oversights, they were reminders that every blueprint, no matter how brilliant, carried the seeds of its own undoing. The most telling flaws often hid in plain sight. Cracked des Chevalier's legendary concentric walls faltered not from enemy action, but from a single overlooked vulnerability: its underground grain silos, positioned too close to the outer defenses. When attackers set fires above them, the heat ignited stored flour in a catastrophic explosion. Similarly, the invincible fortress of Malbork fell not to siege engines, but to its own grandeur. Its sprawling layout made garrison movement sluggish, allowing attackers to isolate sections one by one. What these failures teach us is that fortress design was never just about strength, it was about anticipation. The best architects didn't just ask, "How do I stop an attack?" They asked, "Where will I fail?" That humility, that relentless self-scrutiny, turned good fortresses into legends. And as we'll see next, even the mightiest walls could crumble when their builders forgot to question their own perfection. Even the most brilliant military minds of the Middle Ages weren't immune to catastrophic miscalculations, and nothing reveals these flaws more starkly than the crumpled remains of failed fortresses. Take the infamous Leaning Towers of Bologna. While Pisa's tilt gets all the attention, Bologna once had not one but two towers deliberately built at precarious angles as status symbols. Their gradual collapse wasn't just an engineering blunder. It exposed a fatal blind spot in medieval architecture, the arrogance of height, the same obsession with towering grandeur that gave us breathtaking keeps like Château de Coucy's 7-story donjon also created irresistible targets. That magnificent French tower, once the tallest in Europe, stood defiantly until 1870, when Prussian artillery reduced it to rubble in hours. The blueprint's fatal flaw, a design so focused on intimidation it forgot survivability. Then there were the silent betrayals hidden in the parchment itself. Some fortress plans specified walls thick enough to withstand trebuchets but fatally underestimated early cannonball physics. The ruined husk of Roxburgh Castle in Scotland tells this story vividly. Its 15-foot thick walls shattered like pottery because engineers hadn't accounted for how gunpowder explosions transmitted force differently than torsion engines. Other failures were subtler. The star-shaped ideal of Renaissance bastions, while brilliant against direct assault, often neglected drainage. Venetian archives contain panicked letters from garrisons at Pomonova, where ingenious angled walls inadvertently funneled rainwater into powder magazines, turning the fortress's own geometry into a liability. What makes these failures so fascinating isn't just the technical missteps, but the human drama behind them. The marginal notes on a crumbling Burgundian blueprint capture this perfectly. A frantic post-siege edition reading, "Never again build gatehouse here," beside a smeared ink sketch of collapsed rubble. These weren't abstract calculations gone wrong. They were life and death lessons carved in stone. Even Saladin's legendary siege of Kerak Castle succeeded partly because defenders had ignored their own blueprints, stockpiling food in beautifully vaulted halls while neglecting to reinforce the cisterns that ultimately cracked under bombardment. Now, modern technology is resurrecting these lost lessons in astonishing ways. LiDAR scans of the Welsh border have revealed buried foundations matching long-lost blueprints from Edward I's campaigns, showing how later castles corrected early ventilation flaws that had turned great halls into smoke traps. In Croatia, thermal imaging exposed why the seemingly perfect walls of Cly's fortress kept crumbling in visible underground springs, detailed in Ottoman siege maps but omitted from Christian rebuilding plans. Even artificial intelligence is joining the hunt, cross-referencing thousands of manuscript fragments to reconstruct discarded designs like the Templars' circular keeps, abandoned not for structural weakness, but because their radical symmetry confused contemporary stonemasons. Perhaps the most poignant rediscovery came from Dresden's firebombed archives, where water-damaged scrolls turned out to hold the key to a 700-year-old mystery. By digitally reassembling charred fragments of a Bohemian engineer's notebook, researchers finally understood why Karlstegen Castle's famed well had run dry. The original blueprints called for an underground aqueduct linking to a distant spring, line later rulers erased to cut costs, dooming the fortress to eventual surrender by thirst. In these long-buried failures, we don't just see collapsed towers or breached walls. We see the unflinching honesty of history, reminding us that every stroke of genius on parchment was shadowed by the very human capacity for error, and that sometimes the most valuable secrets aren't those of success, but of spectacular, instructive failure. LiDAR technology is peeling back the earth like the pages of a forgotten manuscript, revealing fortress blueprints hidden for centuries under jungle canopies and pasturellands. In Cambodia's dense forests, lasers have exposed the ghostly outlines of Angkorian strongholds, their moats and causeways etched into the soil like phantom ink. Meanwhile, in a Welsh parking lot, ground-penetrating radar uncovered the perfect footprint of a medieval castle, its concentric walls and gatehouses preserved in mineral stains beneath the asphalt. These aren't just archaeological curiosities, they're time capsules of military genius waiting to be decoded. What makes these discoveries revolutionary isn't just their historical value, it's how they're reshaping modern architecture. Engineers studying the Angkorian layouts have uncovered ingenious water management systems that could inspire flood-resistant cities today. The Welsh fortress's compact design, optimized for rapid troop movement, is now being adapted for emergency evacuation routes in urban centers. Even the zigzagging trenches of Bronze Age hill forts, once dismissed as primitive, are influencing modern security perimeters with their unpredictable sightlines. The real magic happens when ancient blueprints meet cutting-edge materials. Researchers in Germany are testing 3D printed concrete based on Roman opus cementitium, a self-healing mixture that could give future buildings the same durability as 2,000-year-old walls. Japanese architects are modeling earthquake-resistant skyscrapers on the interlocking stonework of Crusader castles, where flexibility prevented collapse under siege engine impacts. And in Arizona, a military base has incorporated murder hole principles into its drone defense systems, angled firing ports that maximize coverage while minimizing exposure. Perhaps the most poetic application comes from Venice, where engineers battling rising seas have turned to medieval Moorish designs. The same capillary action irrigation that kept Granada's Alhambra lush during sieges now informs pumps protecting Piazza San Marco from Aqua Alta. It's a full circle moment. Technology that once safeguarded kingdoms against human invaders now defends cities against nature's siege. These rediscovered blueprints challenge our assumptions about progress. When a 13th century Welsh castle's ventilation system outperforms a modern prison's airflow, or when Khmer engineers' watershed management puts contemporary hydrology to shame, it forces us to ask, have we been building smarter or just differently? The answer might lie in merging timelines, letting the past's most brilliant strokes guide tomorrow's blueprints. After all, if a design could outlast empires, maybe it deserves a second act. Medieval water fortresses weren't just surrounded by moats, they weaponized the very element that should have been their weakness. Picture a sprawling stronghold like the Venetian arsenal, where the sea didn't lap passively at its walls but surged through engineered channels, turning tides into tactical allies. Gates submerged at high tide to drown sappers attempting to tunnel beneath. Docks doubled as defensive traps, rigged with hidden chains to snap the masts of invading ships. Even the reflection of sunlight off strategically angled water surfaces served a purpose, blinding approaching armies during dawn assaults. This wasn't just architecture, it was liquid warfare. Fast forward to today, and the Pentagon's notorious bathtub basement, a flood-resistant sublevel designed to withstand catastrophic breaches, owes its DNA to these aquatic innovations. Modern naval bases from Singapore to San Diego now employ smart locks inspired by medieval tidal gates, using sensors to adjust water levels dynamically during threats. Even the Netherlands' Meeslankering, a massive storm surge barrier, operates on principles sketched in 15th century Venetian blueprints. Let water in, but on your terms. The real game changer, though, is how cybersecurity has resurrected the water fortress's core philosophy. Medieval engineers knew still water-bred stagnation and vulnerability. Their solution, keep it moving. Today's firewalls mimic this with defense in depth, where data flows through layered digital moats. Intrusion detection systems act like medieval watchtowers, spotting anomalies in the digital current, while decentralized networks replicate the fail-safe channels of a Maltese fort systems. When one path is compromised, the flow redirects seamlessly, a concept straight from the playbook of Rhodes' naval engineers. Perhaps the most striking parallel lies in psychological warfare. Just as water fortresses used reflections to distort an enemy's perception of distance and strength, modern militaries deploy digital mirages, a false network traffic that mimics medieval decoy gates, luring hackers into labyrinthine traps. Even the Pentagon's much-discussed active defense strategies echo the boiling oil shoots of crack des chevaliers. Instead of merely blocking attacks, they retaliate with overwhelming force. What these echoes prove is that the past isn't just prologue, it's an operating manual. When Ukrainian engineers jury-rigged floodplains to stall Russian tanks in 2022, they unknowingly recreated a tactic from the Siege of Leyden in 1574. And when architects design floating military bases today, they're borrowing from the Aztec Chinampas artificial islands that doubled as defensive strongholds. The lesson is clear: resilience isn't about reinventing the wheel, but remembering how the ancients made it roll through hell and high water, literally. Now let's surface an even deeper secret. These water fortresses weren't just defensive marvels. They were economic engines, turning their liquid boundaries into highways of wealth and power. Venice's naval architects didn't just build fortresses, they conducted symphonies of water and stone. Take the legendary Forte di Sant'Andrea, guarding the lagoon's entrance. Its blueprints reveal tidal channels engineered like organ pipes, tuned to the Mediterranean's rhythms. At high tide, seawater would surge through hidden conduits, flooding enemy sapper tunnels with terrifying precision. But the real stroke of genius, the same system could reverse flow during low tide, draining besiegers' makeshift bridges and leaving them stranded on shrinking mudflats. This wasn't passive defense, it was hydrological warfare, where engineers treated the Adriatic like a bowstring to be pulled and released at will. Across the North Sea, the Dutch elevated this principle to staggering heights. The 17th century fortress of Naarden didn't just sit near water, it became water, built on a hexagonal artificial island. Its concentric moats functioned as liquid ramparts. Blueprints show sluice gates calibrated to millimeter precision, allowing defenders to raise water levels by exact increments. Attackers wading through knee-deep floods would suddenly face chest-high torrents as hidden valves opened beneath them. Even the vegetation played a role. Reeds planted along the fortress edges concealed underwater stakes, turning approach routes into gruesome obstacle courses. What makes these designs so startlingly modern isn't just their ingenuity, but their sustainability. Venetian engineers calculated tidal patterns centuries before climate models existed, aligning fortress foundations with lunar cycles. Dutch water castles like Muiden incorporated saltwater-resistant mortar mixed with crushed seashells, an ancient precursor to today's corrosion-proof concrete. These weren't brute force solutions, they were dialogues with nature, acknowledging that the strongest defenses work with ecosystems rather than against them. Historians point to an even deeper brilliance in these blueprints, their psychological dimension. The fluctuating water levels didn't just physically hinder attackers, they bred paralyzing uncertainty. A causeway safe at dawn might be submerged by noon, while tidal traps turned retreat into deadly calculus. Modern security experts see parallels in today's adaptive perimeter designs, where environments can reconfigure dynamically to disorient intruders. The lesson transcends time. True resilience isn't about creating static barriers, but shaping spaces that think and react. Now, beneath the ink of these plans lies a question that haunts contemporary architects. How do we apply these principles to rising seas and superstorms? Venice's most floodgates owe their DNA to medieval sluice systems, while Amsterdam's floating neighborhoods echo the Dutch Republic's amphibious fortresses. The most radical ideas come from Bangladesh, where architects are reviving ancient, floating fortress techniques to build schools and hospitals that rise with monsoon floods. These living blueprints remind us that the past isn't just a relic, it's a toolkit for survival, waiting for the right hands to wield it again. What continues to captivate historians isn't merely the engineering, but the worldview behind it. These architects didn't see water as an obstacle to conquer, but as a partner to dance with, a philosophy written in every curve of their canals and every angle of their floodgates. In an age of climate crisis, their blueprints whisper a radical truth. The future of defense might not lie in taller walls, but in learning to flow like the tides themselves. Dr. Elena Torres leans over the weathered parchment, her gloved finger tracing the labyrinthine corridors of a 14th century fortress. "Look at how these passages intertwine," she murmurs. This isn't just architecture, it's a chess game carved in stone. Every corridor forces attackers into vulnerable positions, while defenders move like knights on a board, always 2 steps ahead. Her colleague, military historian Professor Rajiv Menon, nods in agreement, tapping a different section of the blueprint. "See these staggered gates. They're not just barriers, they're lessons in layered security. The first rule of medieval defense was universal: never trust a single wall. Always have a fallback position, a hidden exit, a second line of resistance." These builders understood contingency planning better than most modern corporations. What emerges from their analysis isn't just a collection of ancient tactics, it's a masterclass in adaptive thinking. The famed double walls of Constantinople, for instance, weren't merely physical barriers. They represented a psychological strategy. The outer wall weakened attackers, the inner wall shattered their morale. Modern security experts recognize this principle in today's cybersecurity protocols, where firewalls and encryption operate in similar tandem. Even the placement of medieval arrow slits angled to cover blind spots mirrors the overlapping surveillance zones in contemporary airport security. But perhaps the most striking parallel lies in the concept of defense in depth. The concentric rings of cracked chevaliers didn't just slow invaders, they forced them to expend resources at each layer, like peeling an onion under fire. This exact philosophy now shapes everything from bank vaults to digital networks, where sensitive data is buried behind ever deeper authentication barriers. Professor Menon points to a marginal note on a Crusader blueprint. "Here the enemy will waste their arrows." It's a sentiment echoed in modern defense budgets, where the goal isn't always to stop threats outright, but to make aggression exhaustingly costly. Beyond the battlefield, these blueprints whisper truths about human nature itself. The ubiquitous murder holes sealing openings for raining destruction weren't just killing tools. They exploited a primal instinct, the terror of unseen threats from above. Studies of urban design today show how elevated sightlines still subconsciously influence pedestrian behavior, proving that medieval architects grasped cognitive psychology centuries before it had a name. Even the rhythmic spacing of fortress towers, calculated to create overlapping fields of vision, finds its echo in modern store layouts designed to maximize surveillance while minimizing blind spots. As Dr. Torres carefully rolls the parchment, she reflects on the most humbling lesson these designs offer. Their genius wasn't in perfect solutions, but in anticipating failure. Every fortress has a weak point. The brilliance was in controlling how, when, and to whom that weakness would be revealed. It's a principle that resonates from medieval moats to blockchain technology, where the transparency of vulnerabilities becomes their greatest strength. These crumbling blueprints, then, aren't relics of a bygone era. They're living conversations in stone and ink, challenging each generation to ask, how do we protect what matters, not just from the threats we know, but from the ingenuity of those who would outthink us? The answer, it seems, was always in the walls. From Aleppo's ancient walls to the glowing screens of digital reconstructions, these fortress blueprints are more than relics. They're masterclasses in human ingenuity. Each stroke of ink, each carefully calculated angle, tells a story of civilizations refusing to surrender to the inevitable. What makes these designs timeless isn't just their strength, but their cunning. They didn't just stand against armies, they outthought them, turning geography into an ally, physics into a weapon, and even the elements into co-conspirators. Consider the sheer audacity of it all. Medieval engineers, armed with little more than quills and intuition, designed structures that could withstand years of siege, outlast dynasties, and in some cases still dominate skylines centuries later. Their blueprints reveal minds that saw every resource, whether a cliff face, a river's current, or the trajectory of the sun, as a thread to be woven into an unbreakable tapestry of defense. And perhaps that's the most enduring lesson. True resilience isn't about brute force, but about perception. The greatest fortresses didn't just bar the gates, they made invaders question whether the gates were even the right target. This legacy lives on in unexpected places. Modern cybersecurity experts study the concentric defenses of cracked des chevaliers to model layered firewalls. Urban planners analyze the traffic flow of medieval castle towns to design disaster-proof cities. Even video game designers borrow from these blueprints, crafting virtual strongholds that challenge players to think like 13th century siege commanders. The principles haven't faded, they've evolved, proving that the past and present are in constant conversation. So the next time you stroll past an old stone wall or lose yourself in a strategy game, pause for a moment. Those pixels or weathered stones carry echoes of brilliance of architects who turned survival into an art form. If this journey through the hidden language of fortresses has sparked your curiosity, let us know which stronghold captivates you most. Was it the mathematical precision of Constantinople's walls, the biological warfare of the Alhambra's B corridors, or perhaps the sheer audacity of Frederick II's rotating towers? Drop your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most fascinating blueprints. Until then, keep looking closer, because the greatest secrets are often etched in plain sight, waiting for those willing to read.